Well, we welcome everyone to the fourth annual Scarboro Missions Lecture here at the Fraser Center for Practical Theology at Regis College in the University of Toronto. In Toronto here, it's 7:30 p.m. With just a little bit under the freezing temperature, a little bit of snow on the ground. And in my background, you'll see a little bit of the old and the new Regis College. And from Professor Dadosky's side, you'll see a little bit of the inside of the new Regis College. We welcome you to the Scarboro Missions Lecture on the topic of God is Interreligious, honoring the legacy of Ovey Mohammed. We'd like to begin first with the land acknowledgement, which is common for all of the University of Toronto and its colleges. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. By way of an introduction of the work of the Fraser Center and its mission, the programming offered by the Msgr John Mary Fraser Center of Practical Theology and the Scarboro Missions Chair of Interreligious Dialogue was made possible through the Scarboro Missions legacy. Scarboro Missions is a society of apostolic life of Canadian Catholics, priests, and laity, motivated by the Spirit and dedicated to the person, teaching, and missions of Jesus Christ as expressed in his words, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full," from John 10:10. The Scarboro Missions legacy seeks to further its ministry work by providing financial assistance to deserving organizations with like-minded objectives. As a Jesuit institution, the Fraser Center at Regis College also adopts principles of Ignatian spirituality for its wide variety of engagements and programming. Allow me to introduce some of our Fraser staff at the beginning of this evening's talk. A special thanks to Associate Director of the Fraser Center, Ms. Fiona Lee, who's a doctoral candidate here at Regis and the Toronto School of Theology. And she is behind one of those screens somewhere up here. We also express our gratitude to our technical expert and an MDiv student at Regis College, to Ashley Tran. So she's also should be popping up on your screen somewhere there. So the format of this evening will be a presentation by our main speaker, which will last about 50 minutes, and our respondent will have about 10 minutes. And the remaining time we will dedicate to a question period. And so, without further ado, let me introduce the main speaker as well as the respondent. And I see that Professor Dadosky has turned off his camera so that he gets a still shot of his introduction. Anyways, here we go. Professor John Dadosky, Ph.D. and S.T.D. is the current Scarboro Missions Chair and Interreligious Dialogue at Regis College within the University of Toronto and Toronto School of Theology. He is the author of The Structure of Religious Knowing by SUNY Press in 2004, The Eclipse of Recovery of Beauty of the University of Toronto Press in 2014, and he's a co-editor of 4 volumes of the collected works of Bernard Lonergan, including Method in Theology, published in 2017, and the final archival volume in 2019. In 2018, he published Image to Insight, The Art of William Hart McNichols, which won the 2019 Arizona New Mexico Book Award in Art. He has published numerous articles on Lonergan, bringing his thought into engagement with ecclesiology, Vatican II, and dialogue with Buddhism. He is also past treasurer on the board of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the current treasurer on the board of the American Theological Society. He is a captain in the Canadian Armed Forces Reserve in Toronto, where he serves as a lay Catholic chaplain. And he's also currently the director of the Msgr John Mary Fraser Center for Practical Theology at Regis College. And the respondent this evening is Professor Abrahim Khan, who has a Ph.D. from McGill and an honorary doctorate from the University KF of Nitra. And he is a faculty member in the Faculty of Divinity at Trinity College and is a cross-appointed to the Graduate Center for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. He is past president of the Canadian Theological Society, was a senior fellow at Harvard University Center for the Study of World Religion, a consulting editor of the Encyclopedia of Caribbean Religions, and an executive officer of the International Association for the History of Religions from 2005 to 2015. Locally, he is also the editor of the Toronto Journal of Theology. Of his academic interests, we can include cross-cultural and comparative studies in religion. His research and publication stream includes Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, religion and international diplomacy, and religion, healing, and medicine. Some of his most recent publications related to tonight's theme include Islamic Influence in the Caribbean, Traditional and Cultural Healing Practice, published in 2013, Mohammed, Iqbal, and Kierkegaard's Judge William, published in 2011, The Idea of Person with reference to Islam, and Mohammed as object and subject, as well as Indian Identity and Religion in Caribbean Literature, the Shikwa Complaint, published in 1998, among numerous other publications. So without further ado, we'll now turn to the main speaker of this evening, and we welcome Professor John Dadosky.
Thank you, Professor Skira, and thank you especially to Professor Skira for his stewarding the Fraser Center while I was on research leave the second part of last year. He did a wonderful job, and we're always appreciate his professionalism and expertise that he brings to the Fraser Center. And thank you too to Ashley and Fiona for all their wonderful hard work behind the scenes before and leading up to today. Just going to share a screen here. Professor Ovey Mohammed devoted his life to exploring the boundaries of Christian religious pluralism at the Toronto School of Theology. His death in November 2020 is an occasion to explore the theological question of whether God's self-communication or mission in history is somehow intentionally interreligious. Whether the great religious traditions of history were willed by God as part of the soteriological plan and a mystical tapestry for reasons that only God can know in its fullness. No doubt similar thoughts would have occurred to Professor Mohammed, of whom this talk is the subject, given his lifelong passionate commitment to interreligious dialogue, education, and comparative theology. In what follows, I will briefly survey Ovey Mohammed's method, rooted as it often was explicitly in Ignatian spirituality. I will then identify how this method demonstrates a new way for Christians for viewing the mission of God in history. This method is exemplified in what David Bosch calls an ecumenical paradigm shift, and by what Robley Whitson envisions in his coming convergence of world religions. In short, mission is no longer to be conceived of narrowly in terms of one's own religion, but rather it is to be conceived as God's self-communication in the created order as explicitly interreligious. Likewise, it reflects God's love for religious diversity and God's desire for human beings to transcend their limited conceptions of God's action in history and to search for a deeper dialectical and foundational unity. In a development following Bernard Lonergan's third stage of meaning, one characterized by interiority, there has arisen the notion of a fourth stage of meaning characterized by horizontal relations with the others, especially the marginalized, and vertically towards transcendent value. The notion of a fourth stage prefigures the advancing reign of God on earth. Likewise, in my own interpretation of Vatican II, I argued this paradigmatic turn towards a wider ecumenism with other religions is distinctively Ignatian in spirit and is reflected in an ecclesiology of friendship. By Ignatian, I mean in a twofold manner. It effects a shift in Catholic theology to presuppose God's generosity on the one hand, and it requires tools of discernment for discovering and celebrating those genuine expressions of such generosity on the other hand. Ovey Mohammed's life and work embodies this post-Vatican II shift through his pioneering work. Ovey Mohammed, hereafter I'll refer to him as Ovey, was the product of a complex religious upbringing. Born in Trinidad in 1933 to a Hindu mother and a Muslim father, he eventually converted to Christianity and became a Catholic Jesuit priest. He was ordained in 1975. During the course of his development, he received degrees in English, classics, and education before going on to theological studies at Regis College. Upon completing his Ph.D. at the University of St. Michael's College, he would spend his entire career at Regis College as an interreligious educator and a dialogue comparative theologian. He was a pioneer in Catholic-Muslim dialogue, as well as with Hinduism and Buddhism, but he is also an explorer in comparative theology. Ovey was at once a religious educator, a dialogue theologian, and a comparative theologian. The three are intertwined. As a religious educator, he believed one was not properly educated in one's home religion unless one had knowledge of other religions. His vocation was first and foremost to educate Christians and challenge them on their attitudes of exclusivism where appropriate. He did this through multi-religious education throughout his teaching career. Vatican II had called for seminarians to have knowledge of other religions. For decades, Ovey taught his Christianity and World Religions course to theological students at Regis College and the Toronto School of Theology. He specifically enjoyed challenging his Christian students and disrupting any settled beliefs they might possess. Among the benefits for Christians studying other religions, he claimed that multi-religious education is beneficial in revealing what he called the demonic elements that can manifest in decadent expressions of religious belief. One can think of the historical example of the Inquisition, for example. The study of other religions also offers Christians an opportunity to explore neglected dimensions of their faith. It gives fresh insights into the possibility of creativity and understanding the faith. Religious pluralism is part of Christian history and must be integrated into its tradition, not with the belief that all religions are equally true, but because religious pluralism is here to stay. With respect to his work as a dialogue theologian, in an interview in the Scarboro Missions magazine in 1990, Ovey concludes, quote, "Growth through interreligious dialogue is therefore the response to the call to a full humanity, the call to wholeness and so to holiness, the call to participate in God's mission to men and women everywhere," end quote. A common theme in Ovey's writing was how the dialogue with mystical traditions with other religions granted one reprieve from the sometimes heavy emphasis on abstraction and dogma in Western Christianity. This mainly occurred through a discussion of religious experience where dialogue provided a space to share such experiences. What he called the meeting place of religious traditions, he claimed, is in the depths of the soul. Our connection with others is intimately connected with religious experience. As a comparative theologian, he was generous with the commonalities between religions, more so perhaps than contemporary comparative theologians would grant today, given their reliance upon specialized methods and how the field has developed. His generosity was likely linked to his own living dialogue as the child of an interreligious marriage, as well as his later Jesuit formation. In his spiritual exercises, Ignatius sets a high standard for listening to the other, in what is referred to as the presupposition. Likewise, Ovey was impatient with the Catholic Church's position towards other religions, especially Asian religions, and he was one of the first to criticize Nostra Aetate, one of the achievements of Vatican II, for not going far enough and moving Catholicism beyond the need to proselytize to the religious other. He was much more pleased with the joint pontifical document, Dialogue and Proclamation from 1991, and its more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the role of dialogue, especially its acknowledgement of the mutual enrichment that occurs in dialogue. Was Ovey's Jesuit vocation also an avenue where he could attempt to reconcile the interreligious marriage of his Hindu mother and Muslim father? He specifically mentioned that his family context bolstered his interest in interreligious dialogue as a Jesuit. Ovey's method was first and foremost to educate other Christians on the value of other religions, not only for their own sake, but for the value the insights from other religions bring to one's own Christian self-understanding. Secondly, being a dialogue theologian, his role was to continue to promote the importance of dialogue in a post-Vatican II context. As stated above, Ovey saw the value of Nostra Aetate as correcting the past, but he believed it was insufficient for advancing the dialogue, particularly with Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. He is critical of the document for what he calls its overtures towards these three and the lack of substantive engagement with them. Keeping in mind that Nostra Aetate was significant for sanctioning a new relationship with other religions, Ovey was already looking ahead to the deeper theological questions that would arise in the dialogue. In what follows, I will focus on his comparative studies and how those are performatively or explicitly Ignatian in his approach. I will then conclude with a suggestion about how Christianity might understand religious pluralism, considering its changing notion of mission and within an eschatological perspective. Islam. In Ovey's published and reworked doctoral dissertation, we find no explicit reference to Ignatian methodology, nor should we expect to, since his topic predates Ignatius by focusing on the medieval Ibn Rushdi, or Averroes, as known in the West. This is perhaps Ovey's most erudite work, a study meant to qualify him for the academic guild. However, when one studies the thesis and conclusion more closely, one sees Ovey's method is performatively Ignatian in two ways. First, he does this in his application of the presupposition of listening to the other. Secondly, part of that presupposition advises Christians to, quote, be more eager to put a good interpretation on a neighbor's statement than to condemn it, end quote. In this way, Ovey is more apt to save the presupposition of his Islamic interlocutors. Ovey sought to give Averroes a more favorable reading against the medieval attacks by Bonaventure, Albert the Great, Aquinas, and the Latin Averroes commentators who accused Ibn Rushdi of denying the immortality of the soul. Ovey pointed out that his critics, namely Aquinas, relied solely on one work by Averroes, his commentary on Aristotle. By contrast, Ovey argued that Averroes's position needed to be interpreted more broadly through his works on the intellect and on revelation. In this manner, Ovey provided a potentially more positive reception of Averroes's position for Christians. He not only provided a favorable interpretation of the doctrine, but also in a performative manner, he assisted potentially in the amelioration of Muslim-Christian conflictual debates and fostering a renewed appreciation for Averroes by other Muslims. His conclusions are nuanced, sophisticated, and diplomatic. Ovey states, quote, Averroes' treatment of the soul and intellect exemplifies the harmony of faith and reason, but his treatment of the soul, including its immortality, harmonizes philosophical reason with the Islamic faith and the doctrine of the Quran, end quote. Ovey's book, Muslim-Christian Relations, is written primarily for Christians in order to educate them on the basics of Islam and to show how the two religions need not be in conflict, if for no other reason than because the two religions, along with Judaism, are traceable to a common ancestor and a common holy city. But specifically, Ovey sees resonances in the Sufi traditions of Islam with biblical teaching and in the Ignatian spiritual exercises. In his general overview of the Sufi tradition, Ovey identifies some common themes in Sufism: an emphasis on a direct experience of God, purgation as preparation for contemplation, the practice of repeating the name of God or short phrases, breathing practices, self-forgetfulness, that is, freedom from distractions and sudden insights of wisdom. Ovey outlines the three stages in Sufi mystical development. They are purgation, contemplation, and the unitive way. Purgation alleviates internal obstacles towards God. The longing for God leads to contemplation. Contemplation includes the practice of repeating words or short phrases known as dhikr or remembrance, along with rhythmic breathing. The mystic aims towards fana, a state of self-forgetfulness. This state leads to a direct experience and ineffable knowledge of God, or ma'rifat. A vowed member of a religious order himself, Ovey likely saw resonances in Sufism with those of Christian monastic traditions. But he also sees a direct parallel with Ignatian spirituality. He took as his clue Peter J. On's comment that Ibn Ada Allah's Kitab al-Hikam, or Book of Wisdom, was equal for Muslims as Ignatius' spiritual exercises was for Christians. Ovey follows on by drawing direct parallels between the themes found in Sufi mysticism and those of Ignatius. For Ignatius, he states, as for the Sufis, to know God, it is necessary for us to abandon our own will and to make it correspond to the divine will. Like the Sufi way of purgation, Ignatius begins his exercises explaining the need to be rid of inordinate distractions, disordered actions, and worldly loves. The first week of the exercises invites the retreatant to focus on their sins and shortcomings. In a word, detachment from these desires occurs as a kind of purgation. Like the Sufis, Ovey interprets Ignatius's view of purgation as a prelude to contemplation about God. Freedom from external distractions assists towards this endeavor. In his second and third methods of prayer, Ovey states, Ignatius, like Sufis, recognizes that the repetition of a single word or phrase coordinated with one's breathing is an effective method of contemplation, end quote. The goal of self-forgetfulness resonates with Ignatius's notion of freedom when one focuses more singly on God's will for oneself. In terms of the potential for direct experience to lead to a non-discursive knowledge of God, he quotes Ignatius. It is not so much knowledge which fills and satisfies the soul, but rather the interior understanding of and relish of the truth, end quote. Finally, such a non-discursive experience resonates with Ignatius's description of an experience of transcendence as consolation without a cause, and leads one into deeper unity with God. Abiding with God becomes increasingly effortless. In his book on Muslim-Christian relations, and in one of his last public lectures, Ovey emphasized that the common heritage of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam lies in the spiritual ancestry of Abraham. This common heritage, along with the common spiritual home in Jerusalem, should provide a basis for focusing on common ground rather than rivalrous differences. Undoubtedly, Ovey would have affirmed a common basis for the dialogue of religious experience as well. Hinduism. Ovey wanted Hinduism to be taken seriously by Christians, and he specifically did not suffer what he called them the overtures of Nostra Aetate gladly. He felt the document gave the impression that Hinduism was, quote, a hodgepodge of beliefs, and that it characterized it incorrectly as escapist in its spirituality. By contrast, he viewed Hinduism as a complement to certain integralist tendencies in Roman Catholicism, and that he believed Hinduism's emphasis on spirituality could give Catholics respite from what he termed the dry bones of dogma. Because he viewed Hinduism as more of a theocentric approach than Christianity, he believed that Hinduism was better disposed to a theology of religious pluralism. He cites as a particular example the Bhagavad Gita's acknowledgement of multiple incarnations. Ovey also suggested that the attraction to Hinduism by Westerners is due in part because it offers more practical techniques for loving God. Perhaps one can say that Western Christianity's focus on truth does not always lend itself easily to sufficient praxis and techniques for union with God. In his own work, Ovey specifically identifies parallels between Hinduism and Ignatian spirituality. He did this in 4 essays, each of which overlapped somewhat in terms of content. In Yoga, Christian Prayer, and Zen, he directly compares the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali to the Ignatian spiritual exercises. He compares the latter to the 8 stages of yogic progress outlined by Patanjali. The abstention from evil or yama, observances or niyamas, postures, asanas, rhythm of breath, pranayama, withdrawal of mind from sense objects, pratyahara, concentration, dharana, meditation, dhyana, and instasis or samadhi. Ovey argues that, quote, the 8 elements of yoga given by Patanjali are paralleled in Ignatian spirituality. While it is not necessary to rehearse in full his comparisons here, the exercise demonstrates how, in his view, the resonance between the two spiritualities is a natural one. Christianity, Ovey states, in its Western cultural expression, is really unintelligible and unappealing to the vast number of Indians and other Asians, end quote. He liked to be provocative. In this article, he speaks of the importance of a dialogue with Hinduism, but his presumption was one of enculturation, as he highlights successful Christian enculturationists such as Robert de Nobili, Henri Lassault, Bede Griffiths, and others. One of the principal attempts at enculturation was with the Trinity as Satchitananda, being, understanding, and bliss, and also in the establishment of monastery ashrams. In terms of the dialogue encounter, Ovey emphasizes how Western Christianity could learn and adapt non-European accretions to the faith. In another essay, Ovey compared Jesus to the figure Krishna in Hinduism. He concludes that in both figures, quote, God made salvation possible to all by becoming incarnate, end quote. For Christians, this entails an acceptance of salvation as a gift and would likely imply, although Ovey does not make it explicit, a recognition of Christ as the fullness of the incarnation. The essay admittedly focuses on similarities without engaging in the differences. However, as pointed out before, he is generous in granting Hinduism what Ignatius would call a most favorable interpretation. He also draws a specific link between the teaching in the Gita with that of Ignatius when emphasizing the experientially based knowledge of God. Ovey points out that both Krishna and Jesus highlight the importance of individual as well as communal salvation. He argues for a, quote, liberation theology of religions, perhaps one of his keenest insights, as a possible way forward for Hindu-Christian dialogue, given that social injustices and human suffering provide more conciliatory starting points for dialogue. Writing in the late 1980s, Ovey specifically perceived a lacuna in the comparative studies in the spiritualities of Hinduism and Ignatius Loyola. He sought to fill it by engaging a specific comparison between Ignatian spirituality and Hinduism. Since then, of course, there's been subsequent research, such as by Francis Clooney, but this was early on in the dialogue. Ovey states, quote, the parallels between Ignatian spirituality and the karma yoga ideal of the Bhagavad Gita are astonishing in spite of the distance from each other in time and in spite of the theological differences in the traditions of Christianity and Hinduism, end quote. He explores several parallels highlighting what he calls the spirituality of action and Hindus call karma yoga. Specifically, Ovey is interested to emphasize how each tradition understands the relationship between contemplation and action. Both Ignatius and the Gita emphasize that God is active in trying to save the world. Likewise, both presuppose that God wants our cooperation in this endeavor. In the spiritual exercises, Ignatius calls for co-laborers with Christ. The reign of God is not simply an internal reality, but an external one in which the co-workers cooperate with God in bringing about this reign. Therefore, the retreatant meditates on the two standards and is propelled toward a choice for God. Quote, our one desire and choice should be to what is more conducive to the end for which we are created, and that's St. Ignatius. Similarly, the Gita reveals Krishna as incarnated as part of God's intervention into history. Likewise, the emphasis is on improving and saving the external world. In Krishna's dialogue with Arjuna, he enlists his followers' help to join him in the good fight. This is analogous, as Ovey points out, to the existential choice demanded by Ignatius's two standards, insofar as Arjuna is also faced with a deliberate choice. Next, Ovey sees a parallel between the spiritual exercises and the Gita in terms of a focus on detachment. The very title, spiritual exercises, refers to the challenge of exerting effort in order to free ourselves from inordinate attachments. For Ignatius, nature is basically good, but human beings are disposed to the temptations of worldly love. The disordered attachments interfere with our inner freedom. Therefore, Ignatius espouses indifference, not to other people, which would be apathy, but rather he admonishes that the retreatant not to prefer, quote, health to sickness, riches to poverty, honor to dishonor, a long life to a short life, end quote. Total detachment, Ovey explains, leads to a total commitment to God, and this is our goal. Similarly, for the Gita, Detachment is central. Ovey quotes Krishna stating that he loves the person who treats friend and foe equally. I wish I could do that. Quote, who has put away attachment and remains unmoved by praise or blame? Quoting the Gita. Ovey cites other examples, but he concludes, quote, the pair of opposites the Gita uses to illustrate detachment are reminiscent of those which we find in the spiritual exercises. They are profit and loss, victory and defeat, success and failure, friend and foe, love and hate, good and bad, end quote. One of the significant contributions that Ignatian spirituality has to offer is an understanding of the relationship between contemplation and action. Ignatius has a unique approach to the relationship between the two, but Ignatius gives priority to action since we are co-creators with God. One can abide in God equally in contemplation, but simultaneously in ministerial activity. Contemplation is at the service of action, but Ovey also sees the Gita expressing the relationship between action and contemplation. The Gita passages he cites do not seem to present a preference for one over the other, but rather a balance between the two. The priority in the Gita appears to be union with God as fundamentally important and the activity and contemplation as secondary, but both are valid. However, citing the Gita, Ovey points to the question Arjuna puts to Krishna, where Krishna suggests that action is better. In short, both Ignatius and the Gita affirm contemplation in action as an alternative to simply contemplation. Next, Ovey turns to the twofold goal of the active life. For Ignatius, this twofold goal is the salvation of oneself and of others. Likewise, for the Gita, the twofold aim of karma in yoga is the salvation of the individual and that of the welfare of the community. Again, Ovey is responding to those who would eschew action for contemplation alone. Although equally, we can say that those who advocate action without contemplation would also be imbalanced, although that is not his concern in this comparison. Finally, Ovey highlights that both Ignatian spirituality and the karma yoga ideal of the Gita have a notion of ultimate transcendent value that is at once eminent and transcendent. Cheers. Buddhism. We see Ovey engaging with Buddhism by attempting to find complementary differences between Buddhism and Christianity. In this way, we also see him practicing the Ignatian principle of listening. Ovey acknowledges three ways that Buddhism can complement Western Christianity. This is through Buddhism's emphasis on the, quote, priority of experience over faith, the emphasis on relationship over individualism, and the need to ground praxis in detachment, end quote. With respect to the first, Ovey reiterates the Buddha's teaching that truth claims are perspectival, in part, no doubt, because experiences vary widely among individuals. The Buddha refrained from answering questions pertaining to God's existence, since they can be a distraction from seeking a liberative experience from suffering. Christians often assert faith as a priority as expressed in beliefs and doctrines. The latter have their place to be sure, but for Buddhists, they are rafts that one abandons when one gets to the shore. The promise of dialogue with Buddhists offers a recovery of the foundational experiences that ground those of a tradition. For example, St. Paul's conversion and the course of Christian history he shaped lies rooted in the foundational experience of the risen Christ. Second, Ovey emphasizes how Buddhism stresses the relationality of the individual. The teaching of no self, anatta, is commonly interpreted as no independent self. There are various interpretations. Suffering flows from our misbelief that as individuals, we are somehow self-reliant and independent. This teaching resonates with Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si when he states, everything is interconnected. The Buddhist sense of self is one constituted by mutual relations with others and the entire created order. This is not foreign to the Christian tradition, as when Ovey reminds the readers of Paul when the latter speaks of the oneness of Christ or the Christ that dwells within. Third, Ovey emphasizes that Buddhism can complement liberative and social praxis by following the Buddhist lead in the practice of interiority of consciousness. Therein one finds the roots of violence and justice in between the two ears. I've argued in the past that the methodological liberative praxis of see, judge, and act might be more adequately grounded philosophically by adopting Lonergan's fourfold method here, in which case the method would become see, understand, judge, and act. In fact, Ovey agreed with me on that, although he never wrote about it. Further, it should be said, however, that since Ovey's reflections, socially engaged Buddhism has come to the fore as a movement within Buddhism to impel practitioners towards social action and not just contemplation. Finally, one can imagine that Ovey's linking of contemplation with social action is also influenced by his own Jesuit formation, where one undergoes the 40-day Ignatian exercises, but the orientation of the exercises is inevitably to one's ministry in the world. Fourth, Ovey specifically sees in Zen Buddhism a great resonance with Christian mystical traditions, especially with John of the Cross. Christians, he says, quote, have come to equate prayer with thinking, and I would add to that also with talking. Certain Buddhist practices, such as in Japanese Zen's focus on wordless, non-discursive meditation, as well as enriching their experience, can put Christians in touch with similar experience in Christian mystical traditions. Much like Ovey's familiarity with the Ignatian presupposition for dialogue and learning, he cites the Buddhist principle of upaya, which recognizes that any method or doctrine is potential wisdom for enlightenment. In his essay, Yoga, Zen, and Christian Prayer, Ovey specifically compares Zen Buddhism to Ignatian spirituality alongside of Patanjali, as I showed above. Ovey sees more direct comparisons between Patanjali and Ignatius. Still, there are some comparisons with Buddhism. The concentration and meditation practices in Zen are not foreign to Ignatius's second and third methods of prayer. Again, referencing the spiritual exercises, Ovey states, quote, the repetition of a single word or phrase coordinated with one's breathing can deepen concentration, end quote. The fruits of both spiritualities lead to the same ability to see clearly. Comparing Ignatius's mystical experiences on the banks of Cardener as a kind of enlightenment, Ovey opines, quote, seeing reality more clearly and the cosmic feeling that all created things are bound up together belongs to the very essence of Ignatian mysticism as it does to Zen. In sum, it is clear that Ovey's comparative engagements with Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism were approached from his specifically Ignatian orientation. In the final section, I will speculate on how such interreligiosity can be addressed in a Christian theology of religious pluralism. God is interreligious. The famous dialogue theologian Raimundo Panikkar described his religious identity in this way, quote, "I left Europe for India as a Christian. I discovered I was a Hindu and returned as a Buddhist without ever ceased to be Christian," end quote. Likewise, Peter Phan has argued that to be religious in our contemporary situation is to be interreligious. Diana Eck states that the Christian pluralist requires a humility so as not to, quote, "limit God to the God we know or to the particular language and image through which we know God," end quote. As stated in the beginning, Ovey's life example has been the occasion for reflecting on the action of God in the hearts of others, and it seems that God does not mind doing so in an interreligious way. In other words, it is the occasion for us to speculate about the mission of God being an interreligious one. God's love is teeming throughout the created order, and God's love of diversity seems to disrupt our settled notions and thoughts about God's ways. Quote, "If we want to hear God's word in the world today," Ovey states, "we must listen to all that God has spoken," end quote. That voice can be found in the genuine teachings and representatives of the world's religions. However, if we are to take the truths of other religions seriously, Ovey questioned, where does this leave the normativity of our faith, he asked. In turn, he answers, quote, "It leaves it where it is, but enriched by fruitful dialogue with other religions." However, is enrichment the goal of interreligious dialogue? Or is the pluralism we face challenging theologians to rethink their understanding of mission and God's saving action in history? What if God's saving action in history is intentionally interreligious? If we are to ask whether such action is interreligious, that God intentionally wills religious diversity as part of God's divine plan and the origins of the created order, then how are Christians to make sense of this reality given their unique claims about Christ? Karl Rahner and Joseph Ratzinger both speculated about a small Christian population in the future, but for different reasons. While their speculations were likely rhetorical, both argued for quality over quantity. I've argued extensively in other writings that religious pluralism, of which Christianity must engage, reflects a broader zeitgeist indicative of a fourth stage of meaning. This fourth stage is a development of Lonergan's three stages. The fourth stage thematizes the turn to horizontal and vertical alterity, reflective in many movements in philosophy, cultural studies, psychology, religious studies, and theology, to name some of the main ones. Such achievements as the church's teaching on the preferential option for the poor, the rise of liberative praxis, and more recently, an alterity that considers our care for the planet, each reflects this fourth stage of meaning, this ecumenical, wider ecumenical paradigm shift. Theologically, a fourth stage thematizes vertical and horizontal relations so that from a Christian perspective, it prefigures the reign of God coming on earth. The church in the fourth stage of meaning will need to understand itself not only in its own relationship with God in the Judeo-Christian revelation, but in its relations with other religions. But how is it to reckon with a secularism where the attitude is that religion is somehow no longer necessary, or you should at least just keep it very private? And if God's fullness in the revelation of Christ in history is for Christians a decisive point in salvation history, why would God allow its significance to wane in the face of growing religious numbers in other religions and its increasing irrelevance in secular attitudes in the polity and the academy, to name only two arenas where its influence is currently challenged. Let me suggest that Christians can view God's saving action in history vis-a-vis other religions and secular culture as a second kenosis in anticipation of the second coming of Christ. Let us suppose that the incarnation proleptically or anticipates the final culmination of the created order and the second coming of Christ is spelled out in the creed, just as the first incarnation is preceded by the kenosis. He emptied himself and took the form of a servant, as in Philippians 2:7. So can we expect that there is a second kenosis of God's action affecting a self-emptying of the community of the faithful prior to the second coming of Christ, and this is part of God's saving plan? Of course, this kenosis would not mean that God's action is waning in the world, but rather it is hidden, only to be discerned and discovered. Relatedly, Kierkegaard had a spirituality around being hidden Christians in the secular world. For Christians, this second kenosis may mean a self-emptying of any triumphalistic attitudes towards other religions and a humility in finding genuine seeds of the word and fruits of the spirit and the religious other. Finally, am I betraying the dialogue by suggesting that ultimately reference to a second coming of Christ locks me into a fulfillment model in my approach to other religions? I've never been fully comfortable with those categories, for I see myself as a pluralist inclusivist. In short, God's love includes everyone, or at least is offered to everyone. At the same time, there is a mystery and magnitude to God's action that subverts our limited worldviews, and I am willing to take the religious claims of other religions more seriously than the inclusivist might take them. To quote Shakespeare, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt up in your philosophy." In this paper, I have focused on the living example of Ovey Mohammed, the son of a Muslim father and Hindu mother, who became a Christian and Jesuit priest, and a lifelong commitment to interreligious education, dialogue, and comparative theology. While much remains to be understood, the living example of my former teacher, friend, and colleague provokes the question in me, as I hope it does in you, that God may be interreligious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that wonderful talk. And it was very interesting to hear some elements of Professor Ovey Mohammed, of which I did not know. So that was very enlightening. And so as I say that, it provides a segue to allow our next respondent, Professor Abraham Khan, to respond to your talk. I would just point out before he begins that after the response, we will be taking questions under the Q&A button, so not in the chat button. So we'll only be moderating the Q&A button. So without further ado, we turn it over to our respondent.
Thank you, Professor Skira. John Dadosky's presentation is a fine tribute to the life and work of Professor Ovey Mohammed. It offers a recognizable picture of our late colleague as educator and dialogue theologian, engaging the world religions in an Ignatian way, in todo amar y servir. It renders Ovey's pioneering work on Muslim-Christian dialogue in terms of the post-Vatican II shift within the TST curriculum in the areas of ecumenism and mission. We find in the curriculum now that the acceptance of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists as dialogue partners, of their faith traditions as instancing God's self-communication, and of religious pluralism as a fact or given, getting integrated to Christian history and in our theologizing. Hence, Dadosky's rendering of God as interreligious. In missions, the shift in understanding means stepping outside the exclusivist boundary of Christian doctrines to minister to all God's people everywhere, and growth through dialogue with other faith traditions generates the momentum for mission work to gain the perspective of God's love for religious diversity in human history. Mystical awareness, along with sense and intellect, circumscribe for Ovey the locus theologicus. Beyond concepts and doctrines, religious experience, as reaching the inner depths of our soul, is the space for interreligious dialogue. The presentation highlights experiential insight as a starting point for bringing Christianity into a dialogical relation with Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, instead of seeking to Christianize them. In short, interreligious dialogue is a means of challenging our understanding of both mission and God's saving action in human history. All well and good so far with the limning of Professor Mohammed's work. Dadosky's next move is to extend by forming up the idea of God's love for religious diversity as part of the divine plan. For this, he imputes to Lonergan's 3 stages of meaning a genetic 4th stage of transcendence to thematize vertical and horizontal relations from a Christian perspective. Vertically, church and mission are to be understood in terms of the Golgotha event. The event is proleptic, and I think it's much more so than the incarnation. The event is proleptic of a second kenosis, or coming of Christ, to culminate in God's saving action or plan. Correspondences of this verticality are the Quranic revelations to Mecca, revelations in Mecca and Medina, Krishna's discourse with and theophanic disclosure to Arjuna, and the Bodhi Gaya enlightenment and Deer Park sermon of the Buddha. To Dadosky's fine tribute, hardly anything is there for me to add. Yet not to fall short of this honor to respond, I briefly share 2 marginalia items. One marginalia item, Ovey conveys with Ovey concerned with educating at a pastoral ministerial level, would ask how you as a Christian minister would deal with the following. A young couple is coming for an interview about their upcoming marriage, but one of the partners is a Muslim. On the day of the wedding, would you do a reading from the Quran? You are approached by the head of a Hindu group who would like to use the church basement for a prayer meeting. What would be your answer? A 23-year-old woman has just been killed in an accident. but she has been deeply influenced by Buddhism. Her parents are devout Christians, and you have to speak at her funeral when many of her friends or Buddhist friends would be there. How would you consider our parents? How would you console our parents? I mentioned these pastoral level challenges to embellish the dimension of Ovey as educator. A second marginalia. Postulating a fourth meaning stage, transcendence, Lonergan's three stages, leads me wondering two things. A, the fourth stage may be methodological, rhetorically sufficient for extending Ovey's thought about a second kenosis, God's self-emptying of divine privileges for a second coming. Does the fourth stage follow necessarily from the three? Or is it a rhetorical adjunctive? A second marginalia. To postulate a second kenosis, self-emptying of divine privileges, may also be unnecessary when we understand that the second coming, as a cipher of transcendence. In the second coming, Christ does not dwell on the earth, is not the Christ of humility, but of glory, the one who redeems humanity. What is a cipher? That aspect of transcendence not immediately given, but required extrapolation through reason and reflection. More recognizable example is Moses in the burning bush. I am who I am, referenced by a tetragrammaton, YHWH. The second coming, scripturally understood, requires no self-emptying, for it is Christ the Redeemer who comes to give rest, to deliver on the invitation issued by Christ in humiliation. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden. By that Christ, with open arms carved by the sculptor Bertolt Thorvaldsen. In theological language, cipher is rendered as divine unknowability by apophatic theology. Resonances of unknowability are heard in the three faith traditions engaged by Ovey, the interreligious dialogue theologian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan, for your response this evening. I will allow Professor Dadosky to perhaps voice any responses or comments he'd like to make to Professor Khan's comments.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Khan, whom we're on a first name basis, Ivan. And yes, it's interesting because the title of this talk, God is Interreligious, came to me after I was working as a chaplain, and I had a Indian Hindu in my office who was telling me about his marriage to a Muslim woman in India, and he was telling me about how the family, the challenges about how the family negotiate that, these two are in love, right? And the love that they have, is from God, presuming, right? And I saw what their love is kind of analogous. So that's taking the importance, the love of this Hindu man with the Muslim woman is taking priority. And if that love is from God, it's almost like it's God saying, okay, we're, what's important is the relations with people and secondarily the religion. So I was just starting thinking about this, that, God can do whatever God wants and bring people together. And and doesn't seem as concerned about religious differences as we are. That seems to be more of a human thing. I'm not espousing for a syncretistic blending of all religions. I'm not, because I uphold to the uniqueness of the religions, and that's why interreligious dialogue, I think, is so challenging in comparative theology. The other thing I would say is that the second kenosis is not the second kenosis is a kenosis of the mission. That just as they were Christians, some of the Jesus movement were expecting a conqueror to come in as the incarnation, and it was a baby in very humble origins, and was not expected that, you know, we would have assumed that the early Christians would have thought that one day this Christian mission, Christianity, will be everywhere, the main dominant religion. And what's canonic is that the mission, because you know God's got all the time in the universe, right? And this is why, for some reason, this is how God likes to act, surprising us. And of course, as you probably know as well, there's a lot of kind of analogies with Buddhism in that too, and abruptly disrupting our thinking patterns. So those are my initial comments. I'm still thinking through this. This is an exploratory lecture on my part. So that's it for me, Jerry.
Okay, thank you very much. Just as a reminder that the question should be posted under the Q&A button, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So don't put the questions in the chat room. And I know our panelists are concentrating on listening to each other and taking notes, so they're not following the chat. But there are a lot of kudos and thank yous and greetings from many of our constituents from all over the place. Some are here locally and some and farther reaches. Just to before we go into the question period, and in case these pop up in the future, there will be a video link posted to the Fraser website, so that you can get a copy of this video, watch a copy of this video. It is being recorded. And if you'd like to also be added to the Fraser mailing list, it's a fairly new institute here within the Regis College, and so we'd love to add you to the mailing list. So please email on the contacts again at the Fraser website. And also as a reminder, in a couple of weeks, we'll be doing another, Fraser Center will be doing another talk on the Abrahamic series on February 24th, and the details are also on the other website. And again, just to note in the chat, there's a whole bunch of comments and congratulations and thanks. It goes without saying, we should also add a little bit of a personal dimension about Ovey Mohammed for those who knew him. He was a very kind gentleman, and I remember him fondly. He always spoke in a very intentional and slow cadence to make his point, choosing his words, and he had a wonderful and occasionally sometimes wicked sense of humor. And so that's kind of the personal dimensions we have of our colleague Ovey, and again, fondly remembering him. So I see some questions that are popping up on the Q&A, and we have one from one of our doctoral students here. Albert Prolov asks, how does Lonergan's idea of the absolute objectivity of one's verified knowledge correlate with John Hick's idea that one cannot know the real immediately and without the reflective prism of the constraints imposed by one's specific society and language? So quite a detailed question there. Does Professor Dadosky, would you like to venture to answer that?
I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I did see it before I answer that. I did see a note that Sister Elaine McInnes is here tonight. I just want to say it's an honor to have you here, and Ovey loved you. So it's great to have you here. Albert, that's a really technical question. Maybe I'll punt that for our class next week. It depends. I'm not sure when Lonergan talks about absolute objectivity, he's talking about it philosophically. I don't know enough about Hick to know if he's talking about transcendence, like ultimate transcendent value or not. Not being clear on that, I don't think I can really give you an off-the-cuff answer on that, but we can always rely on you for very substantial questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Tai-Hoon Kim to Professor Dadosky, asking to explain more about the pluralistic inclusivist view in your concluding remarks. This seems to go beyond the traditional threefold categories I'm familiar with, which are exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralistic.
Yeah, and Tai-Hoon Kim is one of our very talented doctoral students too, working with Professor Stober. Christian Crocus, who was also on the line before, I don't know if he's still here. Him and I have written and co-authored an article which we're trying to get published right now on these issues. When I say pluralist exclusivist, I just want some more breathing room than those three categories, those three options. Because it seems to me, and I'm just saying here, if I accept the creeds of the early church before the major schisms in the church, it seems that I'm almost locked into an inclusivist. That was a Freudian slip. Inclusivist notion where the second coming is going to involve everybody, right? But I also find that can be an approach that dismisses the richness of other religions. And there was a lot of controversy around the previous two popes before Francis, their attitudes towards Buddhism, which I don't want to get into here. But they were both inclusivists. So, or at least John Paul was an inclusivist. I want to take the religious claims seriously and push the envelope to find a deeper foundational dialectical unity, if possible. And I would point you to Christian Crocus's book on Louis Massignon, where he documents really well that Massignon was so much in love with Islam that he proposed a way in which Christians might be able to affirm some of the basic tenets of Islam. Pretty powerful stuff. So when I say pluralist, inclusivist, I'm in that kind of frontier land where I want to go further, but I want to go further in a kind of a deliberate exploratory way.
Okay, thank you. Rob Alonso asks, perhaps from a different perspective, he says, I cannot help but wonder if God is interreligious, but if the human search for God can be interreligious. So I guess he's turning the question around. That is, can we search for God as one holy people?
Well, certainly that quote I had by Raimundo Panikar was someone who experienced God interreligiously. And in fact, the Catholic Theological Society's convention theme this year is exactly that, which I don't know if Frank Clooney is still here, but he's in charge of that this year, and he set the theme for that. So that's possible. When I say God is interreligious, I'm really talking about the mission of God to save all of humanity and the created order, to bring us all home. That God does not seem to be as concerned about the external affiliation as the internal orientation and love of God. And but to say that, I'm not discounting the truth claims in Christianity or the other religions. I'm exploring a new terrain. And that's okay. I mean, 100 years before Aquinas, they had more questions than answers. That's why they called it dialectic, the sic et non. So we're at one of those places where we got more questions than answers theologically. And to become comfortable with that is just to practice some good Buddhism. Comfortable with the unanswered question, the existential anxiety. Thanks, Rob. Wow, it looks like we might get to go to bed early tonight.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, perhaps I can probe you a little bit on the question of engaging in comparative theology or interreligious dialogue. We as Christians live in a particular tradition, and we want to engage the other and to more deeply embed ourselves in another to understand that. Could you maybe explain a little bit on how you understand that methodology or that approach to engaging in not just simply dialogue, but trying to experience another religious tradition?
Well, I think as Christian and I have said on our essay, which hopefully will be accepted, that at one point we talk about levels of participation. So all of us can go to a Jewish Seder meal, okay, and that doesn't make us Jewish. Or you can go to someone in Brazilian candomblé and have your fortune read, but that doesn't make you a practitioner of candomblé, although you're participating in it to some extent. Some traditions may allow for more levels of participation. And one of the questions that one of the doctoral students, I think Mike's doctoral student is going to be working on is, what does it mean to be meditation? Is that religious when you do Buddhist meditation? Is that religious? And so I think there's a lot of questions that will come up that also involve the context. That involves that interplay between learning and exploring and participating. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder if Professor Khan has written extensively also on interreligious dialogue and aspects of that, and how he would understand that methodology of comparative theology within his own work, if he would like to follow up on what Professor Dadosky has just said.
Well, methodologically, I propose that we look at one tradition as illuminating another tradition, and that another tradition also illuminating the tradition that is being illuminated by. So you have what I call reciprocal illumination that is going on in interreligious dialogue. And at the end of the day, whatever kind of occurs is something that I kind of alluded to in the end of my response, and that is that you end up with metaphors. That whatever kind of language you come up with, it's really metaphorical language with respect to the object of reality, ultimate reality. And so in a way, you end up with Msgr Cartiers and all the people in the apophatic tradition. But it doesn't mean that you don't believe. Well, I don't want to go in the direction of Lonergan, but I do think that Lonergan...
Yes, you do. Go.
John has written extensively on this fourth stage, and I'm not convinced about the fourth stage, that it's really necessary. And that conviction has to do with what Lonergan has to say about judgments, that it functions, that it has a double kind of function. And so, I wonder about the interiority,
Sure.
that whether it doesn't really, it doesn't have a second function, the transcendence exigence.
Oh,
and that
absolutely.
transcendent
Yeah.
exigence
Yeah.
is such that it doesn't necessarily imply that heavy kind of theology. But if you want to put the heavy Christian theology, that's fine. But at the end of the day, it's like Wittgenstein. It's like Wittgenstein ladders or scaffolding.
Right.
Once you've got where you want to, then you may dispense with them. So what is it that we may dispense with? Many of the doctrines and truths and so on. And it then comes
Right.
down to what is in the heart. And that's why your traditions have it that when they pray, the head, touches the heart in order that the intellect might
Right.
connection with the heart.
Right.
Jaroslav, I don't know whether I answer your question, but you ask about methodology, and I think metaphors, or languages, metaphor or language about divinity or about reality is really metaphorical, and that we have to keep that in mind.
Right.
Okay.
And fair enough. Fair enough on the, I didn't want to bring too much Lonergan into it, but basically the fact that you've been able to teach for the last 20 years, your course Pluralism is Theological Challenge, corroborates that we're in the fourth stage of meaning, because prior to that, you wouldn't have been able to teach a course like that. So there's something that's happened culturally, and maybe you can start to trace it back to the World Council of Churches, or the first Parliament of World Religions. I think Diana Eck starts there. That might be a good place to start. But anyway, I'm going to have to write more extensively about it. But fair enough. I hope somebody's going to ask me who's going to win the Super Bowl on Sunday.
Well, that is a good question. There might be a blockade of that, given all the protests for the pandemic and vaccine mandates, and so that's an open question still. But we do have another question here, and perhaps the questions that I had posed and your responses were based upon being rooted in a particular religious tradition. But the question we have here to the board is that. To what degree might you and Professor Khan embrace the notion of God as interreligious and beyond? It seems to me that there are not a few spiritual seekers with identifiably religious sensibilities who are not explicitly religious in terms of a sectarian affiliation.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, in my own approach to that, nobody has a license on the love of the overwhelming love of transcendent value, and that transcendent value is head over heels in love with everybody equally, as St. Augustine suggested. And one does not have to be rooted in a religious tradition to have it. I think that's why Pope Francis said something like about this, something along the lines of, it's better to be a genuine atheist than a good atheist than a hypocrite. The advantage of a tradition is discernment. So if you start having strange mystical experiences or things going on, like who are the authorities? Ignatius, Avila, and the Zen traditions, where they've been mapping out this. So the traditions are important because they have this cumulative wisdom to help people discern when mystical experiences start happening. If you don't have that tradition, it seems to me, it can be difficult to discern. So that's, I think, the value of a tradition. And that's one of the values of tradition anyway.
Okay, thank you. There's some other questions that were related to what we've just been talking about, but perhaps I'll just pick up one final question here from Kevin Burke at Regis University. John, thanks for your paper and the way you embody the spirit and openness of Father Ovey. I'm curious to hear you speak more to our current moment in which the question seems to have priority over answers. This doesn't vitiate the category of truth, but as John Sobrino reminds us, if the truth isn't, first of all, good news, it's not true.
Yes, and thank you, Kevin, and welcome. And you're the expert on Sabrina and Eleuterio. So I think theologically we are at a place that's analogous to 100 years before Aquinas, where there were more, before that kind of medieval synthesis. But what that synthesis would look like today, if it was to come about, would be possibly a global collaboration of the wisdom of other religious traditions. You're coming in from the States, which is having a lot of questions around truth right now. Now, the issue really isn't whether or not there's truth. It's just the blatant rejection of truth and reducing everything to bipartisan opinions. I don't know if you were reflecting on that, but given the fact that you know, a lot of people are involved in the social context down there, I thought that might be part of it. But I think there's some wonderful opportunities to explore, and systematic theologians and foundational theologians need to have some breathing room to be able to explore and see what's going to emerge in this dialogue, because we certainly can't afford to go back to rivalrous relations with other religions and violence. I hope that answers your question, Kevin.
One of the drawbacks of being on Zoom is you can't see a nodding head or a yes or a no in a follow-up question, because we're controlling this here. There are a couple other questions on the board here, but we promised to finish on time around 9 o'clock, and I think we've reached that. Just a reminder that today's session has been recorded and will be available on the Fraser website. We do hope you all visit us on the website and the Regis College. And there was some good plugs for some of the courses here taught by our faculty. And if you go onto our Twitter feed, you'll see some of the other courses that have been taught within the Regis College that complement and support the mission of the Fraser Center. Allow me to express my sincerest thanks to the respondent for this evening, Professor Abraham from the Faculty of Divinity of Trinity College. We're very grateful for his participation. We also thank very much the wonderful presentation and erudite expression and the wonderful slides from our main panelists today, Professor John Dadosky, and this fourth annual Scarboro Missions Lecture as part of the Fraser Center for Practical Theology. And with that, we'll say once again, thank you for all those who attended. And we hope to see you soon in the coming weeks and coming months. So once again, greetings from Toronto and a fond farewell from the Fraser Center of Practical Theology. Good evening to everyone.